one that really has not been addressed at all. She's got the major cred from grad school at Harvard, and she has looked at this very unique intersection point between technology and racial issues and youth issues and a very strong background in education. And these issues of race are really core to all of the aspects of consciousness hacking that we're talking about, but it's something that does not really get addressed. So I'm very grateful that you're here and that you're bringing this up and bringing this conversation into this space. So thank you.
Hello. Should I use the one on my... Hello, can you hear me now?
Okay.
Like it works if you have a deeper voice? Yeah, okay. So I have 10 minutes, I believe?
Yeah, should I move this up a little bit? Okay, we're fine.
That's okay, great. So let me turn on my clock so I don't go over. I had it all ready to go, and then I got distracted by my other apps on my device. So thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I have been passionate about understanding the racial caste system in the USA since I realized I was black in America, and the first introduction to junior high when I was 12 was being greeted with the N-word. And I went to a largely white high school. So since then, I've decided to dedicate my life using social science research to understand the racial caste system in this country, more or less at the systemic level. So a lot of what I do is I talk about things that have happened to me and how I want to understand that's a microcosm of what's happening systemically in this country. Did anyone hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So first of all, not everyone understands what racism is, and this is 10 minutes long, so I don't expect everyone to actually understand everything in 2 paragraphs, but I want to actually put up how I'm defining systemic racism. So racism is the systematic mistreatment of certain groups of people on the basis of skin color or physical characteristics. Even though many people engage in individual acts of racism, it is more effective to focus on racism at the systemic level. The term systemic racism was developed to articulate how race and racism have negatively shaped the development of society in the USA at the structural, systemic, and institutional levels. But more importantly is that very distinctive social worlds have been created over the last 4 centuries due to racism. Hence, the current effects of systemic racism are cumulative, which have manifested as multi-generational exclusions from opportunities, resources, and power today. Such manifestations can be observed within economic, health, food, educational, political, criminal justice, and technological systems. So over the past 3 years, I've been engaged with the Black Lives Matter movement as a social scientist and really understanding what's going on. And it's actually a continuum of what most people of color engaged in anti-racism have been doing for decades. So Black Lives Matter is kind of part of that continuum. So for those of you who are not clear what Black Lives Matter goals are or their history, I can just tell you very quickly. It was founded after the murder of Trayvon Martin to address the systemic racism and anti-black violence within the USA. And it's inclusive of all black lives, especially black marginalized lives, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, survivors of domestic violence. And basically they do action for change through policy and law, grassroots organizing, workshops and training, research and analysis. So I'm a person that comes from a background of engaged Buddhism and engaged mindfulness. So I'm always interested how to talk about the racial caste system with everyone, regardless of how they identify in America, without judgment, without shaming. And I actually ran across this quote that I thought would be good for this group. And this is kind of within the context of what has happened in the last 1.5 years. In the aftermath of Ferguson, Staten Island, and Baltimore, America is having a long overdue conversation about race and justice. Buddhist communities in America, even those filled with many well-meaning people, are subject to the same forces of unconscious bias and the same historical and institutional legacies of privilege and racism as the rest of the country. How Buddhist communities choose to respond to these painful legacies will matter greatly. So over the course of the last year and a half, I really shifted and really trying to understand it all. So I'm a mother of 3 kids who are red as black. You know, I'm thinking about things that are happening, their future. I'm thinking about what I see on social media. And a lot of the things that I see are misunderstanding of Black Lives Matter. A really misunderstanding of what racism means today versus 1950s or 1960s. So there's just a real unclear understanding of how Black Lives Matter's movement means to not just black people, but how it reflects how systemic racism operates, and that a lot of people just don't have that literacy. So I'm thinking, how can I use technology to bring people together in a mindful way to understand this? And I'm kind of focusing on people who tend to be post-racial, who think race is not an impediment for equity and happiness and equality in this country. So these are the challenges that I observe primarily on Facebook and Twitter. I actually use social media to get themes of what's going on in the real world in terms of race and equality. So the challenges I observed was the lack of critical and compassionate understanding of how ahimsa, veganism, and Black Lives Matters are not separate. So I come from a background of looking at veganism and looking at veganism as a non-violent way of consuming and being in this world, not just plant-based, but literally non-violence, the root. So I saw that a lot of people would post things like Vegan Revolution had posted something like, apparently Black Lives Matter more than cows, more than chickens, apparently. So it was kind of snarky, and there was no understanding that they're not separate, that you can be both an anti-racist and be an ahimsa-based vegan, work intersectionally together to alleviate suffering for non-human animals and black people who suffer from racism at the systemic to structural to individual level. I also thought there was overall this irresponsible use of social media to promote anti-black violence and other forms of racism. So when Tamir Rice was killed, a 12-year-old black kid who was killed at the playground with a toy gun by the police, a lot of people just, use Twitter, Facebook, whatever, to just promote really unmindful, very uncompassionate ideas about Tamir and his family. And I thought, wow, that's just really telling, because people wouldn't say this in a physical location. So what these technological spaces like social media give to me, it shows me how people are really thinking about these. And instead of me having a reactive response, how can I use those disillusioned responses to create technology in a way that can bring us all together, figure out how to dismantle racism in a mindful, non-judgmental way. And then number 3, I noticed that there's a lot of, in general, post-racial approaches to innovative technology. So aside from Black Lives Matter, I've attended a few events like Hack the Future, and then there's another event coming up next year called Bon Appetit. So it's about food and using technology to create a better future of food. But when you show up to the events like Hack the Future, the technology was pragmatic, it was awesome, but no one was really thinking about it in terms of race. So I had talked to a company about them creating an agricultural device for farming and how you could read the data of how much water is being spread out, all this stuff. And I said, have you ever considered promoting this in communities of color that are food insecure and that they're doing their own urban gardening thing? And they said no one's ever actually brought that up, like how systemic racism creates a lack of access to food security in communities of color and how technology can be used. So at Hack the Future, they didn't really talk about anything like that. It was a post-racial approach to technology and food. So these are the themes I'm seeing in most of these tech mainstream spaces, and it's problematic because most of the world is not the 1 or 2% in Silicon Valley that has options and access to the best food and technology. Systemic racism has created a lack of resources, privilege, and power around good food and good technology. And let's do something about that when we're thinking about creating technology. So these are the things I'm thinking of. So my question is, how can technologies educate, motivate, and create solutions in dismantling both implicit racial bias and systemic racism using mindfulness framework? And that's the key, because I've been doing anti-racism work for years, and there's like a camp where people weren't really thinking mindfully about the language chosen, and it's easy to shame and judge people who have racial privilege, and the conversation shuts down. So how can we use it in a way we're not judging, but we're also being proactive and using people's awareness around privilege as leverage to actually make change together. That it shouldn't be on the backs of just people of color to make the change, but people with racial privilege, class privilege, can all do it together. You just have to do it in a way where the language is mindful, compassionate, and loving. So I actually put together a conference the other year using webinar technology. When I noticed all of the themes, at least in the vegan community, this lack of understanding that Black Lives Matter does not have to be separate from ahimsa-based veganism. So I put together this conference called The Vegan Praxis of Black Lives Matter. And it was a safer space, it was easier to access. I got sponsorships to give out to people who need scholarships to attend. It was $20 to $30. All you needed was an internet access in your community center, in a library, in a classroom. The speakers were predominantly racial minorities and allies engaged in ahimsa and anti-racism to bring solutions beyond diversity lip service. And we got a lot of good data, archived chats and presentations. It was eco-sustainable, you're not flying people out. So I made it really accessible because I understand a lot of these conferences, people can't access it because of transportation. People don't have the money to go and fly out somewhere. So I made it very sustainable and very accessible. But it was a very safe space, and it was a very much safer space using this webinar technology. And basically, at the end, we came up with a lot of great resolutions to move forward, and it was global. People went back to their communities to actually teach, yes, you can be an anti-racist, you can engage Black Lives Matter, and you can be ahimsa vegan. It's all intersectional, so to understand the machinery of oppression, it's not one-dimensional. They all feed off of each other. So the thing I'm thinking out next for the next stage is developing an anti-racism app, and it's of course, you know, it's all up in the air right now because it's such a huge, overwhelming topic, diversity, beyond just race and ethnicity, ability, gender, age, everything. You know, how do we develop that? But I'm first starting with the race. So I'm thinking about, you know, people coming with suggestions about how you would develop such an app that, you know, does metrics, evaluation, flagging things that are potentially racist, using mindful language, and integrates gender, sexual orientation, class. And I think one of the most important things when I've been doing social science research around anti-racism and building as a community, that, you know, it should really be built for those and by those most affected by systemic racism with anti-racism allies on the side. So coming from that embodied experience, understanding what it's like to live through a racist society as a Black person, person of color, you can use that diversity as leverage to create these technologies that will acknowledge that from the get-go. So in closing, here's a few resources to get you kind of started on the right way of understanding what it's like to integrate mindfulness into anti-oppression pedagogy. So there's a book by Beth Barilla who talks about this. And it is pretty pricey, but I'm hoping that people who have access to a library can take that up. But this is key, it just came out, like this is timely. And then understanding engaged mindfulness in Buddhism and approaching race and sexuality and gender in a compassionate and way that kind of inspires you to do more than just kind of feel like overwhelmed is a book by Zenju Earthwind Manual, The Way of Tenderness, Awakening Through Race, Sexuality, and Gender. And that just came out in the last year, and it's really good tackling these issues and in a compassionate way that's really important and connecting everyone. So if you want to talk more about what we're doing, I actually represent my own consulting firm called Critical Diversity Solutions. So my website is up here. And you can also email me. You can also talk to my partner, Dr. Oliver Zahn, who's doing the photography as well. More about what we're doing if you want to support us or, you know, in any way, shape, or form. So thank you very much.
So we got a few minutes for questions. Do we have one of the volunteers who wants to do microphone running? Okay, perfect. Thanks, Deval. Okay, so.
Sorry, I took it away from you.
Oh, no, please. Okay, so.
Questions? You mentioned the importance of using kind of moderate language that isn't too polarizing. Can you expand upon that?
Sure. Does this work now for me to properly use it? Yeah, so it's not necessarily polarizing, but I had to learn, and I'm slowly learning how to, well, I guess I'll never be perfect with my engagement with what language to use, because it depends on the crowds where I'm at. But not using inflammatory language, and for me, not just words, but how I phrase things. So when I'll talk to a crowd about racial privilege, I'll first start about talking about my own privileges. and how, whether I'm, for instance, I'm a cisgender privileged woman, that means I was born with a vagina, I live as a woman the heteronormative way. But I know that I'm privileged in that system because it privileges people systemically. I am not overtly transphobic. I have nothing, I have nothing against people who are not gender conforming. But I tell people, I acknowledge that, I'm benefiting from this system that disenfranchises and mistreats people who don't conform. So that type of language where I start from, look at, I'm not oppressed just because I'm black. I also have other privileges. So starting from there, and also not doing shaming or blaming. So, talking about no one can choose how they're born, and I start like that. Like, I understand you can't choose how you were born. Instead of immediately blaming someone and saying, I don't want to talk to you because you're white, what do you know? Like that type of inflammatory language, as if because someone may have white racial privilege, implying they don't know anything about anti-racism is inflammatory. It shuts it down. Does that make sense? So it seems kind of obvious, but for a lot it's not. And a lot of people who largely identify as white and have been trying to do anti-racism work, a lot of times they tell me they won't go past the first thing because they feel shamed, they feel guilted, they don't know what to do with those emotions. So if I'm using the engaged Buddhist mindful approach to anti-racism, I find that's more effective. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm sorry, like there's the books up there, hopefully that's more, but it seems, yeah, it's subtle, but it makes a big difference in continuing people working together to dismantle racism.
All right, we have another one there.
I have introduced myself. I'm Reza.
Hi, Reza.
Whatever that makes a difference. But the question I have is, how much do you think about other cultures, other places when you talk about this? Because when you said, not everyone's like in San Francisco, and then I listened to the entire talk, and it's very sensitive. And then everything sounds like you looking at everything from a glass which is very much San Francisco. Because you go around the world, and suddenly, the lines between what is black and what is white and what is not, or what is treated differently, is no longer, it has nothing to do with gender. It's much more complicated. And, okay, so the question I have to summarize again is, how much do you incorporate other places in the world in the stuff that you talk about?
Sure, so that's a good question, and I want to remind people this was 10 minutes of 10 years of trying to consolidate into 10 minutes. My focus, I should have said at the beginning, is looking at the USA. And I actually don't think I have the credentials or the background to talk about other places in the world, because I actually know that race is different in all parts of the world. Even in America, it's changed throughout time and region. So it's true. I would not be read as black in other parts of the world, and I would be read as black in here at least. I've been told I would be read as white in certain parts of the world because of how I talk, my education. I'm lighter than a brown back, all of that stuff. So right now, I'm only focusing on the USA. I came from the East Coast. I was there for 32 years. It's not really that much different from Silicon Valley on the West Coast. So right now, I'm really just focusing on regions. I was a cultural geographer, so my focus is on regions. And I do know Silicon Valley does not reflect all of the world, but it is incredibly influential. So I'm starting with that, and I'm hoping to build, and I'm already starting to build with other people, global black population and how they're dealing with what's going on there and beyond. And not just blackness, but other marginalized groups that are affected by whatever systems of oppression are in that nation. But we're very small.
And I close it with that.
Yeah.
I think it's very important that you...
Oh, sorry, say that again. That's very...
Is that my hand? I think it's my hand.
It's okay.
I think it's very important for you to look at the rest of the world, and it's very important, even if you don't focus on it, to at least incorporate it. Because what I see is a lot of people talking about race and diversity, but not in the slightest understanding what it means in the entire context of the world. It's very narrow-minded, and I think, especially because you've done all that research, and you know how to do the research, I think it's very useful for you to also incorporate, just take Central Europe. Don't care about the whole of the world. Just take Central Europe and take a different perspective on it.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for condensing. My question was about the anti-racism app that you discussed. You mentioned your goal there is that it should be built for and by minority groups. So can you talk about your approach to like sort of like getting that talent pool together? I mean, like we had discussed a little bit before about sort of percentage of like African American like engineers is small, and so I think this is obviously could be something that's very important to them, but can you talk about your approach in recruiting them to work on that? Because I agree with you that that is very important, who it's billed by.
So to give you more context, like I only started thinking about this 2 weeks ago after going to the Tech and Inclusion Conference in San Francisco. So this is very new, like there's nothing, like this is what you got, like that. So I know it's very big, and I'm not quite sure what it's gonna look like in recruiting. I want to make sure that everyone would be included who wants to do it, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I want to frame it where there's something about, in America, USA, being racialized and spending a fair amount of time here, it really affects your consciousness on how you look at the world, develop things. So with that said, I think it's important for the core who develop that come from that type of consciousness, because so far when I look at apps where it doesn't come from that consciousness, you can, well, with my training, I can totally see how this is post-racial. This assumes everyone is white and middle class and able-bodied. And for me to actually focus more on those who've had the embodied experience living in America most of the time, USA, as a racialized minority, I feel like building it from that framework, it would probably be able to be more relevant for those communities. But also when I say allies, I mean people who may identify as white and are anti-racist allies as somehow supporting that effort too, so we all work together doing it. But a lot of times things are developed without the actual communities that are harmed in mind, even though the app is supposed to be for them, if that makes sense. So that's, but I haven't figured out yet, because like I'm just thinking about this as of a week ago, and trying to figure out what that's going to look like. That's why I'm here to kind of throw that out at everyone to help with that process. I mean, it's big. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to solve a problem, but it's one of the tools of many that I think need to be used if we're going to kind of tackle this huge problem of systemic racism in the USA.
Cool. I would love to just keep going and give more time for questions, but I want to say thank you, Breeze, so much. Please give it up for Breeze Harper.
Thank you.